Hello everyone, how you doing? This is Coach Fleischer and we are in Module 1, Session 3. And for this presentation, we are specifically going over the 7 main movement patterns. A lot like other things we've talked about in this class, when you look at ways to categorize or develop your own taxonomy, a categorizational system, for the human body, we talked about muscles, and we'll get to these in a second in the review. Well, it's the same thing with main movement patterns. You can kind of boil everything down to, if you will, 7 main movement patterns, and all variations of movement are based off of these movements, either individually or as a combination. So without further ado, let's jump into a quick review. We've already gone over general adaptation syndrome. That's a 3-stage process. I tend to throw in also homeostasis, just in terms of, you have this human organism, or the organism itself is at rest, and then you actually apply a stimulus to it. But what we've found is with general adaptation syndrome, if you have just the right amount, you get the right training response, or the right response to allow that single-celled organism to grow. We juxtaposition that with a single-celled organism, with a human organism, and we run it down the list here. You had the stimulus, which was the electrical stimulus, and you have a training stimulus. It could be running, could be benching, could be squatting, could be whatever it is, but that's the training stimulus to elicit the proper training response. And if you have too little, you're not going to have an optimal response. If you have too much, you're going to end up in an overtrained environment. So really the flow through on this is you're looking to apply a training stimulus to the human organism to elicit the appropriate training response to reach the desired training response or goal for that person. It could be training for a 1-rep test out, training for a particular sporting activity, could be perhaps fitting into a wedding dress in October, several months down the road. Nonetheless, it's this process boiled down. We also talked about this alphabetically, 6 main areas you can talk about in the body, even though you can further subdivide like arms into biceps, triceps, forearm, or back or chest as well. And you can also go through and develop your own taxonomy on this as well, and have your own organizational system for these main muscle groups. Planes, we talked about this earlier actually in this section, where we talked about frontal, sagittal, transverse. Front divides the body into front and back, FF, front, front. Sagittal divides the body into right and left sides, sides and sagittal. And then transverse, in green there, divides the body into top and bottom. And when we look at human movement, just to kind of reinforce this, most human movement is multi-plane, whether you're reaching up to grab something off the shelf, down into the floor to put a paper in a shredder, or you're reaching over to your file cabinet. Most movement operates within any one of these 3 cardinal planes. They're called cardinal planes. And it's a combination, one to the other, of combination of one and the other. But what's interesting is most exercise programs, and you see most trainers who are newer in the industry, they function more in the traditional realm, right? They have their clients do more traditional type exercises, bicep curls, tricep pushdowns, shoulder press, etc. Even a lat pull down. It's in a plane of movement, one plane. Whereas most of our daily movement is done in multiple planes. So as a trainer or a coach or a rehab specialist, you have to constantly weigh how much functional movement you want to put into a program versus traditional. Each have their place. It just depends on a particular day, time, and person in front of you and what you'd like to focus your time and energy on. All right? And I know I talked about this before. Sometimes it's easier just to think in terms of I'm moving within a plane of movement. So in this exercise here, this is a squat, lunge to shoulder press with a dumbbell. And I know I showed this in the previous presentation, but it is a sagittal plane movement, meaning the movement itself, if you look at it, if you were to take my body and divide it in half, right and left sides, the elbow and the wrist are tracking in that plane. The knee and the hip and the ankle for both legs is tracking or are tracking in that plane. Now, the one thing I've found with videos in these voiceovers that I'm doing, if I try to talk over the playback on this, it gets kind of garbled. So I'm going to press play, let him go through his workout, get all swole, and then I'll hit pause. So pay attention to what plane we're moving in here. That previous one, sagittal plane all day long, multi-joint exercise, upstairs and downstairs doing a bunch of work, squat, lunge, and shoulder press. Now with this is a dumbbell rear raise while laying prone on a bench. Only one joint is moving, the shoulder, and the pivot point is the shoulder, And as we're doing this exercise, the dumbbells want to be pulled down to the floor. We're moving up and out against resistance, that being the dumbbells. And you'll see later on in class, the resistance changes where the further we go off from our COG and we get perpendicular to the floor, it becomes more challenging out here and easier down here. But nonetheless, single joint exercise, working rear delt, what plane of movement are we in? And again, I'll let this play out, then I'll hop back on. So much like a dumbbell fly for chest press, if you're laying on your back and doing this exercise, you are doing this exercise in transverse plane. If you cut a line right through my midsection where my elastic is on my shorts, that line can go further up to where you have one point on one shoulder, one on the other, and you're cutting a line through the shoulders. So what's kind of quirky on this is, it might be difficult to see, is while you are lying face down, it is still a transverse plane movement. You're going out and up in a line that's parallel with the line that is my elastic in my shorts. Now, I would tell you, if you want to think of this and kind of get a brain bender here, we can let this play a little bit further. If you look at a front raise with dumbbells, that would no longer be in that transverse plane. You're actually in a front raise, you're in sagittal plane. So let's see if we pick that up on the next one. Side raise. Side raise, we're going out and up, right? So the pivot point's the shoulder, we're going out and up away from the body. We're in frontal plane. Ear, shoulder, hip, knee, ankle comprise the line that make up the frontal plane. It divides my body into front and back halves. We're moving shoulder, elbow, and wrist within that plane. And now comes dumbbell front raise. Yeah, I'll even let this play out right here, and I'll let you just see it, and I'll jump out. Alternate arm front raise. We're going back and forth to the front of the body. Nose, navel. You draw a line that divides the body into right and left sides. That is a sagittal plane movement. Got it? Get it? Gotta move on, guys. So main movement patterns. If we look at the 7 main movement patterns, you have a squat, a hip hinge, deadlift, pulling, and pushing. And those pulling and pushing exercise or movement patterns can be subdivided into horizontal and vertical. And just kind of think this through in terms of what exercises can be associated with these patterns. Take a moment, just take a moment to kind of think these through and think like what exercises you can come up with. Well, squat and deadlift are pretty darn easy. The other ones might be a little more difficult, but let's go ahead and jump into a few here. And I think my YouTube videos should be working well for this. Now, if we go ahead and look at this, we have squat, hip hinge, deadlift. I put some exercises over here that are good examples. Barbell squats, Russian deadlifts, deadlift from the floor with a dumbbell, pulling exercises, pushing exercises, and a variation of each. So in this, we have a squat, right? The bar is placed across the shoulders. I've spread my chest. The bar is resting across the beefy part of my shoulders, not on my neck. And when I cue people on squats, just so you know, I tend to cue people to go butt back first, because more often than not, if you say, okay, knees bend and hips bend, usually people bring their knees forward. And if you can visually think of putting a wooden dowel against the tip of your shoe, the knee would slam into that wooden dowel. So you want to think hips back first. Now, this is an important part of the conversation where we talk about what's moving. Hips and knees, of course, but other joints like the ankles have to move to allow this, the lower leg, to move. And also muscles have to fire up in the midsection to help keep me erect. All right? So let me clean this right here. So even though I've bent the hips, I've bent the knees, the ankles have articulated, the muscles have to fire to help keep my torso erect. You can see the bar is resting across the beefy part of my shoulders. So I've peeled my chest back and I've spread my chest and I've peeled the shoulders back, excuse me. I've created a nice rack position across the shoulders. Yep. Nice job, nice squat. All right, so if we jump out to the next one, we look at a hip hinge. This is a stiff-legged deadlift. Now, in a stiff-legged deadlift, you almost can't help but have a little bit of bend in the knees, but we're trying to focus on the hips being where we hinge. And so with this hip hinge, we're bringing the barbell down to the floor. Flat back position, hinging from here, hamstrings are doing the work. Straighter, a little bit straighter knee position. You can tell I'm a little bit tight and I have to offload some work and I had to bend my knees just a smidge. And much like our squat, with the stiff-legged deadlift, there is a bit of a weight transfer between the ball of the foot and the ankle, never the toes and the heel. But this is more hamstring oriented. And we jump this over here. This is a different type of hinge. This is a Russian deadlift. And in the Russian deadlift, there's more knee bend and the weight is now taken off of, the work is taken off the hamstrings and placed more directly on the erector spinae group, the muscles in the back. And specifically, the butt goes back just a little bit more, which allows this hinge to happen here and here. Hamstrings quiet, it puts the load here. So for a power clean, for example, I use this as a progression. You have a first stronger, more deliberate pull from the floor to the knees, and in a power clean, there's a more explosive second pull from the knees on up. I use this as a way to work on general strength for that second phase in the power clean. Additionally, people often work on the rhomboids doing a seated row exercise for the muscles in between the shoulder blades, and they'll do a lot of hyperextensions for low back, but they forget this middle region here, which is specifically what Russian deadlift hits. Deadlift, pretty straightforward, but this is a deadlift from the floor as opposed to holding a barbell. There's a little different variation for you to check out. Keep in mind, knees are bending, hips are bending, a lot like they do on a squat, but the difference is your loading comes from the floor, not over top with the weight on the shoulders. And also because the loading is being provided by a dumbbell, you can stand right over top of that dumbbell and that dumbbell stays nice and tight, its movement pattern to your center of gravity. And hips and knees move just like they would in a squat. It is basically a squat, but it's where the resistance is coming from. It's changing the classification. Bouncing out to a pulling movement, a horizontal row, right? So we're just doing horizontal plane row, but it's a seated row exercise. You can change the position and abduct the arm by bringing the elbow out away from the body to switch the emphasis on this. But for now, this is a plain old seated row that most people are familiar with. Notice shoulders and elbows are both moving to make that movement pattern happen. Now if we go to a lat pull down, now we're going more vertical plane, and think of the difference, right? This now becomes a frontal plane exercise because the wrist and the elbow and the shoulder are all moving in frontal plane as we do our lat pull down. We can change the hand position and use a smaller or narrower bar to make this a little bit more sagittal plane, but right now shoulder, elbow, and wrist are all focused in and moving within one plane, frontal plane. All right, bench press, right? So you have a horizontal pressing movement. Now keep in mind that bar, the wrist, elbow, and shoulders are all moving in parallel to one plane. It's the elastic on my shorts, so you know this is a transverse plane-based exercise. Shoulder, elbow, and wrist are all moving to make that happen. Last but not least, we have an overhead shoulder press. Notice now it's a lot like a lat pull down. Shoulder and elbow are moving, but it's going to be in frontal plane. We're pushing the weight up instead of pulling down. Please take the time to evaluate these a couple of times over.